Jonny, I just wanted to ask you first, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of your book and your alter ego on the screen there, Jonny-san?
Sure, yeah. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah, sure. I mean, the book came about, I guess it's inspired by my work on Twitter. And I guess I started my Twitter account when I moved to the US. In Toronto, I was kind of involved in the comedy scene, and I had a lot of friends who were comedians and writers and stuff. And when I moved to the US, I lost touch with that community, I guess. And so I turned to the internet, and I found Twitter, and I found this weird subculture of Twitter comedy called Weird Twitter, which was just a bunch of anonymous accounts posting like surreal jokes and poetry and stuff. And I sort of turned to that as like a place to be creative and to continue writing humor and telling jokes when I was in architecture school. And I've been doing that for 6 years now, and I've sort of treated Twitter as my writer's notebook in a sense. And after a while, I moved here. I started my PhD at MIT, and I got really anxious and depressed and overwhelmed with the program here, and I needed some sort of creative outlet, I think, to sort of center myself. And so I turned to Twitter, and I looked at sort of like the notes that I put on there, and I started realizing that all those tweets sort of start to create a story and start to create a narrative that eventually became this book.
Your alter ego specifically, how did that vision of that alien come about?
Well, it kind of goes to the Twitter anonymity thing as well, because in Weird Twitter, sort of this like place that I started, a lot of the accounts were anonymous, and they were things like famous crab or like a cool ghost or like ghost with sunglasses or something like that. And like I found that an alien sort of made sense just like as a natural character for me, because I'd always felt like an outsider my entire life. And I think a lot of my comedy is and my perspective is based on this sense of outsiderness, and I think that's a great comic perspective to have, and a very fruitful one. And so yeah, it sort of just happened naturally where I was a literal alien being a Canadian in the US. And so I think all of that got wrapped up into this character pretty neatly. And then by the time the book came around, I'd realized that the story of outsiderness and alienness was something really important to talk about. And so I wanted to tell like an alien invasion story, not from the perspective of the Earthlings, but from the alien who is invading, and sort of draw a lot of empathy and sort of tell the internal story of a visitor coming to a new place, and sort of relate that to like my own experiences and what was going on at the time.
So, I mean, I know it's billed as a work of humor, but it's very emotionally resonant and poignant throughout. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like striking that balance between being funny, but also tugging at emotional heartstrings when you're writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always one of the biggest reasons why I love comedy so much is because I think it's a way into having these other conversations and to be able to speak to other emotions and speak to other sort of sides of the human psyche and of humanity. And so I think my favorite comedy growing up has always been the ones that sort of balance like humor and a little bit of darkness, or humor and other things, and use humor as a tool to sort of talk about other ideas. And so for me, I've always been really excited about the fact that you can sort of get someone on your page with a joke and then start to have another conversation. Like the humor sort of works as a tool to disarm and to sort of empathize with someone else. And then once you sort of Trojan horse your way in, you're able to sort of talk about other things. And so for me, the internet was a place where I learned to be open about mental health, for example, and I learned to talk about a lot of my anxiety and depression in open ways, because on Twitter I had found these communities that were talking about this stuff in open, constructive ways, and it was kind of like a totally different experience than like the real world, quote unquote, where a lot of, I think, these conversations around anxiety and mental health are still stigmatized and are still, people sort of tiptoe around it, and it's a strange conversation, whereas online, I think there were places and there were people in communities that were talking about this stuff openly and using humor as a tool, I think, to address it. And so I wanted to bring a lot of that sensibility into the book, where it is, like, on one page you'll get a really dumb pun, and on the next page, I hope that it explores sort of these kind of deeper ideas.
What's interesting, right, is that Jonny, the alien, comes to Earth to learn about the humans, but we don't see any humans in the actual, spoiler alert, no humans in the actual graphic novel, but what you do see is sort of, all these different animal characters that are dealing with very human emotional issues around, like anxiety, imposter syndrome to a certain degree, the anxiety of an artist too, with the otter, who's also an auteur.
Right. That's one of the dumb puns.
Yeah. But it's sort of interesting that in some ways it becomes even more resonant when you put it through personas because all this stuff is so stigmatized.
Right.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like exploring human emotions in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, like, in essence, the book is extremely autobiographical, and sort of each animal sort of becomes a symbol of, like, each thread of like stuff that I'm working through. And so there is a character that I split off that kind of talks about my feelings of imposter syndrome, being here in Cambridge and being at MIT and being surrounded by all these brilliant people and feeling like I don't belong. There is one of my favorite characters is a hedgehog, because the hedgehog struggles with like the idea of like how to make art or how to make something while feeling like totally unable to do so. And I wrote that character in while I was writing the book, because I was trying to grapple with my feelings of writing the book as I was writing the book. And so it became, that became the character that sort of went through that. And yeah, I think the power of like using animals and using symbols and characters and metaphors is it kind of goes back to like this idea of what humor does too. Like, I think both of these are ways to sort of filter like conversations that are more difficult to have and filter them into sort of easier ways to digest them and sort of allow those conversations to be had in ways that doesn't make someone immediately sort of like step back and become guarded. Like, I think it's easier to talk about like anxiety through like a cute alien character than to sort of walk up to someone and be like, I'm really anxious, help me, I need to unload all this stuff, which is, I think part of why I'm interested in using kind of these symbols and these characters in this way.
Are any of the themes of the book the same things you're exploring in your doctoral research?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, like, I think the other like element of the book that I really love talking about is like structurally, I'm really interested in actually the book as sort of this way to distill like a social media narrative or this idea of how we read the internet. And I wanted to think about, like, this book, for example, it's about an alien who comes to Earth and then meets all these different characters and gets little updates from each of the characters interspersed throughout. So like on one page there's a beaver, on one page there's a tree, on one page there's an egg, and then it goes back to the beaver, and then it jumps to the egg again, and then it's kind of this like very scrambled timeline, which if you think about like a traditional sort of kids book in this form, I always think about like Winnie the Pooh, where like sort of all the characters are like divided into chapters. And so there's like a chapter for the owl, and you get the whole owl story, and there's a chapter for Eeyore, and you get all of Eeyore's story. But in this one, in this book, I wanted to sort of do away with the chapters and sort of think about like how you could scramble all those different pieces of the story amongst each other. And to me, that's how we read like social media now, right? Like, that's sort of the Twitter timeline in an essence, where I go on Twitter and I follow 100 people, and then I get all their updates interspersed throughout. And the book was sort of like this test to see if that type of narrative format could still work in like a traditional medium. And yeah, so that was really fun, and that kind of relates to my dissertation research, which is primarily about I guess, how social media forms community and how different people can come together and find each other online. And I think that's sort of what the book, both, I guess, formally and content-wise, is about. So.
Right, so you talked a lot about the positive aspects of finding community online. There's an anonymity aspect to it where you can sort of create your own persona, but there's also obviously a dark side to that as well.
Sure, yeah.
So do you have thoughts on that, like where things are going well in terms of community and how we can ameliorate some of these issues? Like Twitter, it's this timeline of positive stuff, and then all of a sudden, like there's this toxic brew underneath the surface that comes bubbling up.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think anyone on Twitter has to grapple with and has to deal with. I've seen it like firsthand, and I've seen a lot of my friends sort of deal with like the dogpiling and the sort of bad side of Twitter and the alt-right and the white supremacists and the Nazis. And if I keep talking about this, I'll get really depressed. But I think it's absolutely something that needs to be addressed. I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how a lot of like the community forming tools and a lot of the ways that a lot of the good stuff happens on Twitter is sort of like almost the same technique that like the bad side will take and use to do their work as well. And so like I think a lot right now about this idea that platforms and technologies are neutral, and this sort of way that Twitter kind of steps back from any of the problems going on in the platform by saying, oh, this is like this where we don't have a say in how people use it. Like we're just going to let people use it. And I think that's that's a political stance in itself, and I think it's kind of caused a lot of problems. And I think the next step for like this sort of mentality about technology is to say that these platforms are not neutral and that we need to take a stronger stance in how people use them and what they're used for.
To a certain extent, too, the platforms and the technology sort of set the rules of engagement. So on Twitter, for example, because most people choose to do public feeds in order to get their message out, and these systems that are in place that let anybody mention each other creates an environment where you can have those sorts of interactions.
Right, yeah.
So I'm wondering if in your research you looked into any ways that technology mediates the interactions that we have and what are good choices to make in order to support that.
Well, it's something that I'm definitely interested in researching. I think like just off the top of my head, I've been really interested in how like Twitter seems to be the place where all this sort of conversation is happening now, and it's sort of a place where all this community building is happening now, as opposed to like the other big social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook, where like if you look at Instagram, for example, there's not really a way for two people to interact directly, right? Like Instagram is a much more sort of like broadcast type platform where you post a thing and then other people can comment on the thing. It's much harder to have like a one-to-one conversation on Instagram, which is why I think community doesn't form in the way that it does on Twitter. But on Twitter, you're right, is that it's like it's all public, and now with the quote tweets, I think there's a way to broadcast ideas in ways that sort of are not strictly like one-to-one, and in ways that, like if I quote tweet someone, I've noticed actually a lot, like I've stopped doing this for this reason, because if I quote tweet someone who I don't like or has said something kind of mean to me or in some way, I've noticed that a lot of my followers will then take that as permission to start dogpiling this critic of mine, for example, and it sort of creates like a more toxic environment where if I say, oh, you can all see this person and you can now respond to this person, a lot of people will start to respond badly, right? And I think I've stopped doing it because I think it's not the right way to do it. I don't know what the right way to sort of to have like a good discourse is, but I know plenty of wrong ways from experiencing both sides of it.
I was talking to some friends late last week about when we're interacting with each other in person, there are certain rules of etiquette and certain moral standards that we uphold just by nature of like seeing a person in front of us and recognizing their humanity. And it's interesting when we go online. We can craft our own persona and our own humanity the way we want, but we sometimes fail to recognize other people's humanity. We think it's okay to talk in a certain way that we would never do in person.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a way to bring that aspect of humanity into these virtual communities where it's really, up in your face, hey, this is a person.
Right. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that too. I think, I think Twitter gets a lot of criticism because of its its short-handedness and the fact that in 200, it used to be 140, now in 280 characters, it's harder. It's still hard for people to get a full story in. I think people are trying really hard to work within those confines to sort of be nuanced and to have more of a sort of full picture to what they're saying, and that's through threading, and that's through sort of these longer conversations that they're having on the medium. But I think it's really difficult, and I think it's a lot easier to sort of not recognize that the person you're talking to on the other side of the screen is a person, because you just see a text kind of handle and a bio and an image, as opposed to a person sitting at a screen typing this stuff out. And I don't know how to address that really, because I don't know if the solution is sort of to give everyone pictures of who they are and allow everyone to see exactly who it is they're talking to, because I think anonymity has been really powerful in a lot of good ways, in terms of for example, political dissent, where the most marginalized communities and sort of the most targeted members of certain communities can't put their real identities out there and can't sort of speak against power by putting their real faces online. And so I think anonymity is a great way to, for those communities and for members of those communities to have a voice and to have a say. And so I don't know. I think it's such a big problem, and I think we're right in the middle of it. And I think it's super messy, and I'm just as curious as to anyone on how it's all gonna kind of turn out.
You recently put together Tiny Care Bot, right? Which is just like a bot that tweets self-care messages for people, just to engage with them on that human level. It's interesting that in some ways technology can even be more humane than the people using it when applied. I'm curious what kind of uptake you've seen on that and response from people. Do they like a bot tweeting at them saying you should drink more water and things like that?
Yeah, so Tiny Care Bot is this really simple bot that I made that is, it sends hourly reminders of little actionable self-care tools. And I built it actually for me personally to use. I built it in November of 2016 because something happened during that time that made me really upset. And it kind of kept me on Twitter a lot. And I found that days after, for the whole week or a while after the election, I was glued to Twitter, because I thought that getting the updates and seeing all this stuff would somehow help me understand what was going on. And there was I was caught in this cycle of just being stuck to my phone and stuck to the news and everything. And at some point I realized I needed to get off, and I needed to take care of myself better. And so I built, ironically, I built this thing on the platform that I was using to tell me to get off of it. And I built it because I wanted it to show up in between all the other updates. I thought the best way to enact change was to have an agent on the same platform that I was sort of stuck on right now. And I built that, and it sort of was, and then I tweeted about it, and I think it was the right time and the right sort of types of self-care actions that it related to a lot of other people as well. And it's absolutely not the first self-care bot on Twitter, and it's not the first one that anyone's done, but I think at that point and the specific types of tweets it was tweeting made it really resonate with a lot of people.
It's good. We need more messages telling us when we should engage, when we should disengage, I think, because it can really be overwhelming. So,
totally. Yeah.
So you want to read some of your book?
Sure, yeah, let's do a reading. Do people have copies of the book right now? I like to do it as a read-along for anyone who has a copy of the book. And if not, the slides are up here too, so we can do that as well. But let's start on the first page if you have a copy of the book. It's the page with all the 4 UFOs on it. Whoosh, in comes the spaceship carrying the night sky with it. Wobble, wobble, screech, thump. The spaceship lands. Out come a bunch of aliens. Please find out about the Earth creatures, says the first alien. Humans, says the second alien, pointing to a bird. Yes, humans, says the third alien, pointing to a tuft of grass. Take your time, really, take as much time as you need, says the fourth alien. So, you're leaving me here all alone, asks Jomny. Well, we'll check up on you in case you mess anything up, says the fifth alien. Okay, says Jomny, still worried. Can we go already, says the sixth alien, already bored of this planet. And so off they go, taking the night sky with them as they leave. Everyone's an alien when you're an alien too. A book. Jomny walks along and happens upon a tree. Hello, are you an Earth creature? Jomny asks. Yes, says the tree. I have met a human, says Jomny, contentedly walking away. Jomny sees a snail and kneels down and says, tell me about yourself. To which the snail responds, oh gee, well, nobody's ever asked me about myself. Well, I guess everybody tells me I'm too small and too slow to make a difference in this world, but I'm making a difference in my own world, and I hope that's enough. Jomny comes up to a bear and starts poking the bear. Wow, you're big, says Jomny, not knowing what a bear is. Are you going to run screaming from me then, asks the bear. No, says Jomny, continuing to poke the bear. Oh, thank you, says the bear. Meanwhile, all the other Earth creatures are running away from the bear, and the turtle screams, run! Run as fast as you can! Faster! Save yourselves! Leave me behind and save yourselves! Run! R-U-N! Run! Says one particular bee. Jomny keeps walking and comes along across a dog, and the dog says a word that can roughly be translated to the symbol of a heart. Oh, I'm sorry, I do not understand that word, says Jomny, but okay. Jomny comes across an egg. Hello, what are you? Asks Jomny. I don't know yet, says the egg. Okay, says Jomny. Isn't that exciting, says the egg, shaking with excitement. Jomny comes across a hedgehog and asks, who are you? Oh, I'm an introvert, which is different from an extrovert, says the hedgehog. What's that? Jomny asks. Well, introverts enjoy people watching. Extroverts enjoy people watching. It's a grammar joke. Okay, says Jomny, looking at a flower who he decides must be an extrovert. The flower has the attention of all the bees and is saying, oh yeah, bees, you like this? You like what I got? You like what you see? Because there's plenty of me to go around. And one particular bee says, hi, H-I, hi. Jomny comes across a pond. Swim, splash. You swim very nicely, says Jomny to the otter. Of course, I'm an auteur, says the otter. Hello, otter, says Jomny. Swim, swim. The otter rises. No, wait, I'm an auteur, says the otter, trying to clarify. Jomny comes across a smaller pond and sees a bunch of smaller creatures. Hello, who are you? Jomny asks. It's not about who we are, it's about what we will become, says the caterpillar. That's the gift of being a baby, says the tadpole. Isn't it exciting, says the egg again, shaking with excitement. Jomny thinks of the idea of a gift and goes up to the tree and asks, what is a gift? Can I have a gift? And the tree says, oh, I actually learned to stop giving things to somebody just because they want something. The tree frowns knowingly. I don't think that would end well for me. Jomny asks, what if I give you a hug? And the tree says, oh, I love hugs, but really, you don't have to give me anything to be my friend. What's a friend? Asks Jomny. A friend is anyone or anything who shares a life with you that you would never be able to experience without them, says the tree. Jomny thinks about this and walks up to a bird and says, hello, friend, you used to be a dinosaur. Then Jomny walks up to a skeleton and says, hello, friend, you used to be a baby. The tree pulls Jomny aside and says, maybe stay away from that friend. Okay, says Jomny. Jomny comes across an onion, and the onion says, I'm like an onion. Peel back the layers, and you'll see that deep down inside, I'm just a smaller, more afraid onion. But you are an onion, says Jomny helpfully. Yes, I know that, but now I want to cry, says the onion, feeling misunderstood. Jomny comes across an owl and says, hello, friend. Who are you? Who, asks the owl. Who am I? I don't really know. Everybody calls me wise, and I've tried to learn very much about the world, but I don't feel very wise. And I know that owls are supposed to be wise, so then I don't feel owly enough to be an owl. One day, I feel like one day I'll meet another owl, and they'll take one look at me and say, oh, somebody made a mistake. You're not supposed to be an owl at all. Anyway, who are you? Asks the owl. I'm Jomny, says Jomny. Oh, lucky, says the owl. Jomny comes across the bees again and asks, will you be my friends? And the bees say, sorry, we can't. We're afraid we'll accidentally sting you. Jomny comes across the beaver and shouts, wait, hello, friend, as the beaver runs by. And the beaver responds, I'm sorry. I have work to do. I don't have time to be your friend. I'm sorry. Can't you see I'm in a hurry here? The beaver's Canadian, hence all the apologies. The beaver runs past the tree, and the tree says, oh, don't bother with that damn beaver. But I need to work, says the beaver. Please stay out of my damn business. Then please stop stealing my branches, shouts the tree. They're not yours, shouts the beaver. Yes, they are, shouts the tree. I'm sorry, they're my damn branches now, shouts the beaver. Those are my arms, shouts the tree. What if I never hatch, shouts the egg? Or what if I do hatch, and it's the best moment of my life, but then I never get to hatch again? What if I want to hatch, but also never hatch? Can I do both, or neither? Why are you so worried? You're an egg, says Jomny. That's not fair. You already know who you are, says the egg. But you're an egg, says Jomny, trying to help. The egg rolls over on its side. You just don't get it, says the egg. Oh, says Jomny sadly. Jomny walks along and sees the dog again, and the dog says another word that can roughly be translated to the symbol of a heart. I still do not know what that means, but I know that I'm happy now, says Jomny. Meanwhile, the spaceship flies in again, carrying the night sky with it. Jomny runs up to the aliens and says, I like the humans. They're all so different, and I wish I could be more like them. You're not supposed to like them, says the first alien. You're supposed to research them, says the second alien. I do not like them, says the third alien. He should be more like us, says the fourth alien. He's already too weird, says the fifth alien. Yeah, says the sixth alien, agreeing with the fifth alien. The humans are weird, says the seventh alien. Yeah, says the eighth alien, agreeing with the seventh alien. And so off they go again, leaving Jomny alone with the night sky to contemplate. And that's where we'll stop the reading. Thanks, everyone.
So we'll open things up to questions now.
I liked what you said about sort of mixing humor and darkness, and that immediately made me think of A Softer World and maybe a few other like Canadian artists.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, you mentioned the Canadian beaver in here. Like, do you feel, especially having a bit of an outside perspective, spending a lot of time in the U.S. at this point, anything particularly like Canadian about the work that you do or the milieu that you find yourself in?
I think because I've grown up Canadian and I am Canadian, it's hard for me to sort of see outside of myself a bit to like understand what it is about the work that, and people do respond and say this makes sense that someone Canadian wrote it. And I'm not entirely sure what element of it is. I think there's a bit more of a kindness and a bit more of a, I've heard this like metaphor used across like Canada and the U.S., where the U.S. is a melting pot and Canada is a salad, where the idea in the U.S. is that everyone comes and sort of is expected to ameliorate into this like identity, this single American identity, whereas in Canada, I think that the approach is more of a celebration of all the differences and of all the diverse pieces. And I think ultimately the story that I wanted to tell in this book is a celebration of all the differences and sort of the idea that all these different personalities and creatures and personas can all coexist and get along, not by becoming the same, but by sort of celebrating what's different about them. So I think maybe that's part of it. And yeah, I really do love The Softer World, and I grew up sort of reading that webcomic. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think there's a bit about perhaps Canadian. I don't want to speak to like a broad thing, so I'm not going to. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Thanks.
Hey, Jonny.
Hey, Jen.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate how open you've been about talking about mental illness. But once your private persona became more public, did that change the way you talked about it, or the way people in your life or professional people treated you, or like your own stigma around your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I definitely got, let's see, I think for a while I didn't have like the right language to talk about it, and I sort of didn't grow up knowing that I too could have anxiety and depression, and I didn't know that like therapy, for example, was an option for me until I started like reading about it online, and then until I started like kind of befriending people on the internet who were talking about therapy and talking about mental health a lot. And so I think for me, a lot of why I really care about talking about this stuff in a public way is because I know how much it helped me when I didn't know about it, and when I sort of had a stigmatized sort of internal idea of what mental health was. And so I think I'm trying now to sort of give back to, I know a lot of people sort of follow me and kind of see what I'm saying, and I'm trying to, in my own way, continue to like pass it on and to continue to destigmatize and normalize these conversations. But I definitely think it's become, I think just the way that I've sort of, because I'm so public with it, I think it's become something I have to be really careful about too. And I never want to say anything that sort of brings up any like sort of false stigmas or biases. And I think for the most part, people are really open and kind of kind about it in person, like because you asked about like how it affects me now in person. And I think part of that is self-selecting in the sense that like I don't want to to be friends with someone who's gonna be like, well, that's like dumb, and like pull yourself up. And I think it's sort of interesting because I think the more I've been open about it, the more people sort of know that about me, and sort of I think just the fact that I've been open about it opens up the conversation for other people. And I think if I'm sort of setting the stage of how to talk about it, I think it allows others to sort of come into that conversation in a different way. So I found it really helpful for the most part, but it's also really scary all the time, so thanks.
Hey, yeah, so
Hey.
I was checking out your Twitter earlier, and I saw that you tweet a lot of funny stuff.
Thank you.
I also used to try to tweet funny stuff on Twitter with some success, and
Sure.
a lot of failed tweets.
Sure.
And I was just interested in your perspective on like the tweet writing process, and like when you think of a joke, how you sort of, or like think of something that you think could be funny in the, because it also sort of has to fit the format, and
Yeah.
you have to, like phrase it correctly and things like that. And that makes a big difference, especially when you have
Sure.
so many followers and stuff, like
Yeah.
how many people even see it. So I was wondering if you could just like comment on your methodology, maybe
Sure.
give me some tips.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, even like first to start off, I think I've been on Twitter for so long, and I think it took me like 6 or 7 years ago, I was like tweeting jokes with like hashtags at the end of it, like so and so hashtag joke, hashtag pun, and it took me a while to sort of like understand or fall into sort of like a community and an understanding of how to tell these jokes in a way that kind of suits the format and sort of works with the medium, right? And I think the thing that really switched for me was when I stopped just trying to like tell jokes to get jokes out there, and it switched when I started kind of seeing like this group of writers that I looked up to as a community. And I think Twitter became really fun for me when I started realizing like, oh, I just want to like make jokes with these other people I admire, and it sort of became much more of like, it wasn't about like getting views or getting likes or whatever. It was sort of about like, well, let's like riff off of each other and let's treat this as like this big writer's room. And I think that's when I started really loving it and finding that all of us together had like come across this type of joke telling that people appreciated in a way. I think now I'm very sort of conscious about how kind of like Twitter humor is very different from other forms of humor, right, and other mediums. And even in trying to like adapt some of the jokes I wrote on Twitter into the book, there were a lot that I just immediately struck off. And they're things that I think on Twitter there's a lot of value in sort of the real-time nature of it. And I think that's one of the strengths of Twitter humor, is that you can comment on stuff as it happens right away. And that's like easily that's like political humor and stuff about politics and current events. But it's also just like being part of the conversation as it's happening, and sort of like taking a meme and restructuring it and kind of playing on it as it's sort of fun and kind of in the ethos, right? So like one joke that I wanted to put in the book was like Jomny looking at a cloud and being like, how do I make friends? And then a bigger cloud shows up and says, don't talk to me or my son ever again. And that obviously doesn't make sense now, because that was a meme that was like 2 years old at this point. But I think like I wanted to, yeah, this guy gets. But I wanted to, I think I wanted to make sure that the book was less connected to like this real-time sort of fast-paced, constantly updating type of humor that Twitter is good at. I also think Twitter's really made me a more conscious writer in terms of like structure and format. And I turned to Twitter originally because of the short format, and it really allowed me to like strip away the extra and to really figure out what the joke was and how to tell it properly. And I think it's made me a better writer in the sense that I get to the idea quicker and I get punchier and punchier. I think one of the downfalls is that now when I try to sit down and write a longer piece, I can write like 3 tweets worth of ideas and be like, that's it. Like that's the whole essay. I don't need to write more. But yeah, I hope that answers part of it.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Awesome.
I'll take some of your tips to heart.
Cool, awesome. Hey.
How's it been, kind of being a creative, artistic person with your art out there, and then also dealing with the professional world of graduate school? Like how did your advisor or colleagues or whatever receive that you're, writing a book, being a Twitter humorist, all of that stuff?
Right. I think luckily I've sort of found, again, it's sort of like that self-selecting idea, but I think I've found advisors who understand what it is that I'm trying to do on Twitter and are deeply supportive of it, and have kind of my sort of like thought in terms of like how do I merge this like creative pursuit with an academic pursuit is sort of like what sorts of learned experiences do I have in this like online world in practice that I can look at in an academic way, or that sort of helps like inform me on how to have like an academic conversation about it. And I think I'm sure there are a lot of professors and sort of people in the academic world who are like this is dumb, or they don't get it. But I've been lucky enough that my advisors really understand it and are really supportive of it. And so yeah, that's been really great. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks. Actually, I do want to add too is that like there's a lot of, I think this type of like study, this sociological study of the internet and of internet culture and internet and like media studies, that type of thing is getting more and more traction now. And so one of the, like when I started at MIT, I wanted to look at data-driven cities and understand like urban processes through big data, which is totally different than like where I've ended up, which is sort of like network cultures and kind of the study of media and internet and community. And it really is because, well, at MIT there were a few comparative media studies classes that directly talked about internet culture and like memes and all the stuff that we're talking about now. And it was just cool to me that there were people studying it. And I think there's been a huge community I found that has been really interested. I'm part of the Berkman Klein Center, which is a place that, it's the Berkman Klein Center of Internet and Society over at Harvard, and they're really interested in the confluence of internet and society and politics and activism and AI and sort of all these like human elements that compose the internet. And so I think it's really cool that there are people and pockets that are really interested in this type of stuff. So, yeah, thanks.
You were talking about anonymity on Twitter and some of the other like, social media networks and its influence on poor behavior and how maybe humanizing it would help with that. I'm curious why you believe that's the case. Here at Google, we've got a bunch of internal social networks, and it's 100% known who everybody is. People still opt out of showing faces. They still shitpost. They still troll.
Yeah.
Even face-to-face, I think about watching conversations around here, and you like to think that you'll treat people as more human because it's face-to-face, and people will still treat each other pretty badly on an ongoing basis, the coworkers they spend all their time with. So why do you think humanizing the internet would help?
I think being able to see that the people you're interacting with are three-dimensional people is sort of the basis of any sort of empathetic conversation and sort of empathetic connection to that person. And I think that sort of forms the basis of how I believe we can move forward. I think there's such a divide right now, and I'm not saying like go make friends with someone who like is targeting you and who wants like you and everyone who you identify with to like be killed or something. But I think on sort of like a day-to-day level, it sort of helps build kind of community, and the ways that the communities that I've sort of found on Twitter have been really helpful for me because of the fact that they are just, I think, a lot of people humanizing and empathizing with each other. I think the question of anonymity is different when you talk about kind of like a general, completely accessible, or not completely accessible, but a sort of a general platform like Twitter where anyone from anywhere could have a voice, as opposed to somewhere like Google, which is a self-selected kind of group, and that like in a place like a workplace, I think anonymity is still valuable in certain ways, but I think there's less of a danger kind of associated with like associating what you say with your face. Like if you're I think if you're online and you're like a member of a very persecuted group, you can't really put your face on what you're saying, or else people will find you and sort of identify you, right? And I think that sort of danger isn't present in a place of employment, perhaps, or less dangerous.
So it seems a tenet of faith that humanizing the internet will somehow solve this. We've tried the experiment and found I don't think it did.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, since you're doing PhD research on this, was there any evidence, or is it just a tenet of faith at this point?
Right now, it's an unsubstantiated hypothesis. Okay. So yeah, I'm like super curious to see how, it plays out, and I'd love to talk to you more about it, because like sort of, I've yeah, I've just finished my PhD exams, and so I'm going into the research mode. And so this is actually, thank you, thank you. And so I'm actually, like, this is the right point for me to really figure out what the research is going to be. And so, yeah, I'm excited and happy to talk more about it. Thanks.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey.
Thanks so much for taking the time to answer our questions. I'm Snow, and I do drawings and some painting. And so I'm curious about your artistic work process.
Sure.
So you mentioned that you are an artist slash a writer. So could you just talk about your experience with art, what led you to this project, and what kind of artistic inspiration or creative decision you made that were fundamental to this project?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. I think I've sort of grown up drawing and kind of being involved in like visual design and trying to learn different methods of like communication through a visual medium, right? And for a while, I was really into like painting and street art and sort of these very like lush, detailed drawings and graphics and processes. And when I went to architecture school, I actually got really into technical drawing and like these very detailed like 3D axonometric intricate things. And so I had all that sort of under my belt and in my head when I started thinking about what this book would look like. And I really wanted to make a conscious effort to sort of like step back from that and to minimalize it as much as possible and to sort of make the characters as simple as possible and sort of like as almost resembling icons more than characters, and finding like the balance between how do you like make sort of like this simple, relatable icon image while still giving that icon like enough character and enough sort of humanity and enough relatability, I guess, to be a character. And so that's sort of where I landed. I'm really into, for example, like the aesthetic language of this book is no corners. Like everything is curves, right? And I really tried to make it as like bubbly and as sort of soft looking as possible. And like some of the fun details of like even Jomny, the character, I'm just looking at it now, is there's a little bit of like formal structure to him because he's 3 circles. The belly and like the 2 circles that comprise like the bean. And the rule that I used internally was like the 2 circles that comprise the head, the distance that they overlap is the same distance that the body circle is away from the second circle. And so like there's a little bit of like a math formula involved in that, which is like my architecture background coming out. But for the most part, I tried to keep it as like sort of simple looking as possible. And I found that's been really cool. And like the black and white thing has been cool too, because people on Twitter have started coloring the book and like sharing with me and seeing. And for me, seeing like how other people interpret the book and how they color it has been really cool, because it sort of makes it theirs as much as it is mine, and it sort of creates this like cool connection. So yeah, thanks.
Sorry, just making notes here on the geometric deconstruction of the alien.
Okay, cool.
No, I'm just here to thank you for leaving us this book as a timeless artifact, as opposed to Twitter, which is this, as you said, very like, you know, in the moment artifact, and they both provide different, you know, benefits, but this at least is something that you can return to later without necessarily all that context. And I wanted to pass along the best book review of this, which I got from my kids,
cool.
Specifically my daughter, who is 6 at the time, who after we had read a few pages together, and then I'd let them each go off with it for a bit, she came back to me and very earnestly, very urgently said, "Dad, this book is full of feelings." And so I just wanted to pass that along to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's so sweet. Thank you.
Hi, so just, you know, from the way you talk, I imagine Canada is such a wonderful place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So why did you leave? And what do you have to say to, you know, people like me? I actually want to move to Canada. What kind of advice could you give me?
I often like, I never want to fall into the danger of saying Canada's like this perfect utopia, because it isn't. There are a lot of things that Canada needs to work on as well. For example, it's like its treatment of Indigenous peoples. But I think, I find myself asking that question a lot. Why did I leave Canada, especially in these last 2 years? And I think I'll always see Canada as my home, and like I've always intended to go back there. I think for like myself and a lot of sort of Canadian students who end up in the U.S. have done it because we want to go to a school in the States, and essentially, and that's sort of where, that's like the strongest reason I can come up with for now is I need to be here because I'm going to school here. But at the same time, I've been here long enough that I've really kind of made a lot of American friends and seen kind of what is happening in the U.S. and I've become really invested in the politics here and in sort of like the just everything that's happening, and I really care about my friends who are people of color who are getting persecuted in the U.S. and who have to live in fear all the time, and so it's given me a lot to empathize with here, and I think it's become like a place where I've fallen in love with, but also am deeply critical and sad about. And so, but I think ultimately it's become a country that used to just be like, oh, this is the country south of where I am, as now it's sort of like my second home, and now I really care about what happens here and about my friends who are here and the people who are here. So now I feel like this weird split between like understanding that I'm Canadian and being Canadian, but also deeply being invested in the outcome of this country. So, thanks. David.
So first of all, thanks for being hopeful. Do you ever want to no longer be an alien?
Do I ever want to no longer be an alien? No, I don't think so. I think, first of all, I don't know if that's like my decision to make, first of all. But I think I've been really happy with, or I've grown comfortable with sort of being placed as an outsider and sort of seeing myself as an outsider, and I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think there's a lot of, I think sort of being an outsider to most things allows you to be critical in a way that is harder to see when you're like ingrained in that thing. But yeah, I don't know. No, I kind of like it for now. And I think the best thing about it is that I think like someone once described me as like a public, like lonely person, or like something like that. And I think the kind of beauty about sort of like publicly saying that is that I find other people who also feel like aliens and who feel like outsiders, and together we form like this community of outsiders, and we find like a connection, and that's really sweet. And it never becomes like, it never goes from like a group of outsiders to like one group of insiders. It's always just like this lovely, diverse group of other people, and I think that's really nice, and I kind of really value that. So yeah, I think we should all be. That sounds cheesy. I'm not even gonna say. I think we should all be aliens. But I think, I think there's like a value to that, and I think I'm really happy with my place within that. So yeah.
So I heard you made an announcement about an upcoming next project.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to tell everybody about that really quickly?
Sure. The next book I'm working on is a book with Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's the creator of Hamilton and In the Heights, among other things. And I'm actually really excited about it. It's called Good Morning, Good Night, and it's a compilation of Lin's good morning and good night tweets that are from Twitter. And basically, we compiled them, and I've done illustrations for each good morning, good night tweet. And it's this like sweet, very sweet, cute book that hopefully does something similar to what this book does, in the sense that it creates like this object that people can really hold on to, and that is full of feelings. And and that I think is like this hopeful kind of empathetic object. And yeah, I'm really, really excited about it. It comes out October 23rd. So yeah.
We will be on the lookout.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming again, Jonny.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.